Everybody, it's Claire here from Sewn by Claire, and today we're continuing on with our make of Clara the cat, and that's from this kit here, which is by Lilly Rose Dolls, and we're making the dress today. So we've been working on Clara, which is the felt body, and we've already made her bonnet and her bloomers, and then today we're going to be making her dress. So I want to say a big thank you to Claire and to Richard from Lilly Rose Dolls, because they have provided the kit for me so that I can bring this video to you. And Clara is from their Apple Blossom Woodland collection, and she's a 10-inch doll in felt, and she's just here. So here's how she's looking at the moment. She looks very like her picture, doesn't she, actually? Very cute. And she's got her bloomers on and she's got her hat on, but we're ready to get her finished dress now. So we've got a dress to do, and then that'll just leave us with her pinafore, and then she'll be all ready to go. So I'm really enjoying making this kit. I'll put the website up here for you to where you can get your patterns and your kits from, so that you can have a look too if you'd like to. They've got some fabulous designs and patterns, and especially for little boy dolls. I know Clara's a little girl, but I've actually chosen another little boy doll as well, which I'll tell you about on another video. But yeah, the clothes are fabulous. So anyway, I'll stop waffling after saying thank you very much to Claire and Richard, and then we'll get on so that we can actually get our Clara dressed. The first thing you need to do is have a look in your kit or your pattern and pick out the items for the dress. We don't need the pocket, we just need the dress front, the dress back, the sleeve and the collar for the pattern pieces. And I've spoken before in the other videos, but just in case you're jumping straight into this video, that Claire and Richard of Lilly Rose Dolls are professionally pattern drafting trained. So they put down the cut line for, sorry, they don't put down the cut line, they put down the sewing line for the garment. So none of these pattern pieces have any seam allowance added to them. And I have shown you in other videos how to add the seam allowance, but I'll just run over it again for you just so that you know. I add 1/4 inch seam allowance because I'm from the domestic and home sewing market, so I like seam allowance shown on my clothes. So what we do first is have a look and see where there's any fold lines, and if there's a fold line, then you don't need any seam allowance. So I'm going to put no SA just there for that one, because we don't need to add any seam allowance on the front of the dress there. But on the bottom of the dress we do. So I find 1/4 inch on my seam gauge, or 1/2 centimetre. I put that mark at right angles to the drawn line for the sewing line, and then I mark my position on with little dashes on the bottom of my pattern. I then take a straight edge and I just join those lines together. And I'm just going to square it off on the centre front so that I know where we are with that. So that pattern piece there now has 1/4 inch added onto the bottom edge just here. I'll do the same for the side as well, just to add that on. And just draw that in. Now, when you get to a curve, I do exactly the same thing. I'm going to lose my pattern pieces. I will mark my lines with putting my ruler directly and the mark of the onto the existing curve, and then I will just move it down a little bit closer together, and I will just keep that measure right on that line as I'm going around. And that will then give me the curve that I need to follow. And then I can just freehand those in, or you can use a French curve if you want to, which is a kind of rule. So then we've added 1/4 inch onto that. So I'll just go around and add 1/4 inch onto all of the pattern pieces apart from the fold line, so that you've got that. And then I will then take some tracing paper. Where's my front here? I take a larger piece of tracing paper, pop it over the top of my pattern, and then I will then trace out the pattern piece with the seam allowance added, because I like to work from tissue paper rather than from the actual photocopier paper, because I find the photocopier paper is just too thick and bulky to sorry, making noises, just too thick and bulky to pin onto my fabric. Once you've got all of those 4 pattern pieces together, you might be thinking, well, where's my pattern for my skirt? Well, in the pattern itself, when we get to the skirt, it does give you the measurements you need, because it is just a rectangle of fabric. So here's my piece, and in the kit you'll see that it's been labelled up ready for you. It says dress skirt, and that's been cut to the correct size that you need to use. Just be aware if there's any selvage edge left on the fabric, and I will take that off. There is a selvage edge just left on there, and I will take that little piece off, and that won't matter at all. Okay, so you're going to need that, which is your skirt, so keep that to one side because we won't be working on that straight away. But the piece that we had for the hat and for the dress bodice we will need, so let's get that out again. You can see where I've cut my hat out of it already on this edge here. Let's just put our fabric across this way. And we need to work with the fold for some of our pieces because we've got a fold on the front of our dress, and then we've got some other pieces that don't need to be on the fold, so they can just be put onto the fabric like that. So I'm going to just work with you now just to get the fabric pieces on, the pattern pieces onto the fabric, and then we'll get the dress pieces cut out and we'll be ready to sew. Okay, so I've folded my fabric so that I've got the right sides together, and I've just roughly put this together so that I feel that the pattern is on the straight here as well. So I've looked at my fibres and made sure that they're as straight as they can be, because we're going to be working with our grain lines as well on our pattern pieces that we've got on here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is take my bodice piece, because that needs to be placed on a fold. So I'm going to pop that on down at the bottom just here. Now I need to cut two of these out, not just one. So I'm going to have one here and then one just above it. But let's just pin that on for now. Just keeping our fabric nice. So I've got the fold line of the bodice right on top of the edge of the pattern piece, right on the fold of my fabric. So that'll hold on. And these little pieces can be a little bit fiddly just to get your pins in, but do your best just to try and make that work for you and hold that pattern piece straight so that when you cut it out you can get that as accurate as possible. I'm going to put the next bodice back pattern right next to it, putting those up, and again going to pin that in. And just be careful when you're putting your pattern pieces on. Try to make sure that the edges of your pins don't go over the edge of your pattern piece, because that can mess up your scissors sometimes if you try to cut through a pin when you don't need to. And then we've got a sleeve here as well. Let's pop a sleeve on as well. Now this leaves all of this fabric up here but I need to cut out another dress back, the other dress front up here, and then I need 4 collar pieces as well. And the thing that we need to do with our grain line is we need to just measure from the top of the grain line to the fold line. I've got 7.5 centimetres, and to the bottom I've got 7.5 centimetres, and that will tell you that you've got your pattern piece on straight. So the grain line is that little double-edged arrow, that line with the arrow at the top and at the bottom, and that's what you need to make sure. So like on the collar, we wouldn't put the collar there because that grain line isn't straight. We're going to need that grain line so the collar goes slightly down at an angle, and that will be important for when you're trying to use the bias edge to try and get this collar to sit straight onto the bodice. Okay, so that's got that on. Let's pop this on here. So we only need 2 of the sleeves, that's fine. And we'll use any grain line on there again, just to make sure that that's straight and to measure that in place. If you wanted to, you could cut out multiple versions of your pattern so that you've got the correct number of your front and back pieces ready for putting onto your fabric, or you can just pin them on, cut them out and then pin them on again. Just try to remember to try and keep that fold in the same place for yourself so that all your pattern pieces are on the same line. Let me cut these 3 pieces out. The collar I'm going to do afterwards. I just want to make sure I get the other bits in first. Okay, so let's just do a quick pattern count. I've got 2 of the dress bodice, and that was been cut on the fold, so that comes out as one complete piece. I've got 2 of those. We've then got the dress body back here, and I've got 2 cut out there and 2 here, so that gives me a total of 4, 2 pairs, so that's good. I've then got 4 of the collar cut out, 2 this way and 2 that side, so that gives us the 4 for that. And then I've got the sleeve cut out twice, and that gives us those 2 as well. and then we've got our skirt piece that we've got from our kit. So the first thing we're going to be working with is the fronts and the backs. Let's take the pattern pieces, the pins out of those, and then we'll put our pattern pieces somewhere safe so that we've got that. I'll put mine back in my box, so I've got the safe, and we've got two fronts here, so let's put one there and one just here, so they should be identical. And then we've got our two sets of our back pieces, which is separate, and we're going to then position these so that the centre back, that straight point just there away from the curve of the arm, is in the centre. So we're going to match them at the shoulder seams, but the straight lines there are both in towards the centre. Can you see how that is? Take this pattern piece off so we can make up our second pair. Now one's going to be the outer of the dress and one's going to be the lining of the dress. So if you'd have wanted to, you could have made one out of a different fabric, whether it's a white, a pale pink or a pale green, in order that that then was a different contrast for you. But I'm following the kit. So I've got one which will be my outer here and one which is my lining here. And as you can see, I've got them joined at the shoulder seams on both of them, or not yet, but just lining up with each other. And that straight, long, straight edge is in towards the centre back on both of them. And then each one in turn, I'm going to fold the back over at the shoulder seam, and then I'm going to put a couple of pins in just to hold that fabric together on that shoulder. So that's one on place, and then I'm going to take the other one and I'm going to fold the other one over as well. And then we're just going to repeat that with the other pair as well, and pin those together at the shoulder seam, just in exactly the same way. Fold it over and pin, fold it over and pin, and then we'll be ready for our sewing machine. So if you want to do that same pinning, and then I'll join you at the machining. So I've got my machine all ready. I've got my polyester all-purpose, I've got moon thread in, which I'm happy to use. And we're going to just take the stitch length down to a 2, which is the one that Claire suggests is best for when we're sewing these characters. I've got a size 80 microtex needle, a 70 or an 80 is fine, and I use Schmetz needles, and that's a size 80. And then we've got our pinned bodices here, both of them, 1 and 2, and we're literally just going to put these under the machine ready to sew. The first thing I need to do though is make sure I've got my 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So I put my ruler behind I rest my finger on my needle, put my ruler behind, and I can see where that needs to be. And I know on my machine I need to be with my needle at a position 6.5, and that will give me 1/4 of an inch to the end of my presser foot here, which then allows me to then run that along the side of my fabric, and I can be confident then that I'm sewing with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And a couple of stitches back, just lock that off, and let's put our needle in our work and remove our first pin. I'm just going to carry along the edge there, get close to the other pin, and then we're going to take the other pin out, and then reverse at the end of that seam as well. Needle out of the work, you can cut your threads, and that's got our first seam sewn just there. Let's go on and do our next one. And straight onto a pin, so I'm going to take that one out as soon as I've got it under my presser foot and that I'm happy it's in the right place. A couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches back. I'm going to sew along, and I'm just going to reverse at the end again. Then we'll take our threads off, starting and ending threads off. And then if I show you this is our 2 shoulder seams sewn together. And when we open that out, we can see that that's into start of a make of a nice bodice. So go ahead and repeat that now with your lining, your second piece as well. Sew those shoulder seams, and then we're going to give it a quick press. So I'll join you back when I've got my iron and pressing mat out. Okay, so first thing we've got to do is we're going to press everything flat. So just your back pieces will overlap, but that's correct because that's for the fastening. Just give it a press flat, and that'll just set those stitches just nicely into the work. And then we then can open out the front from the back. Make sure you're right on that stitch line, and give that a press. And then on the other side as well, let's just give that a press. At the moment I'm not worrying about the seam allowance. We're going to flick it over in a second and just open our seam allowance out. So now we've turned it over, I can put my fingernail between those two pieces of seam allowance, and I'm just going to press that seam allowance open, because that will help save bulk on the shoulders, especially being as this is a lined garment. And I'm pleased that it's fully lined, because that gives you a really lovely finish on the inside. So that's one all done with our seam allowances pressed open. Let's go and do the other one. And these steps that we're doing to make this doll dress for Clara are exactly the same as the steps that you would take if you were making a full-size garment, either for yourself or for a child. So if you were thinking about maybe having a go at dressmaking and you're making this garment, you know, for your Clara doll, then just be aware that it does mean that you would be able to use these exact same steps with a pattern for a dress for yourself or for a child. So that's the good thing about doing this. We're doing it all in miniature. You can have a go, and believe me, if you can make these dresses in miniature like this, you can easily make full-size garments, because they're much easier. You've got more fabric, but they're easier. So that's our two pieces all ready. So let's just pop those to one side, because the next thing that we're just going to be working on is our collar. So let's just take our pins out and put our pattern pieces to one side, and then we're going to pin our collar pieces together. I need that to go the other way, don't I, because we're going to be sewing the other way round. So I'm going to put 3 in just to hold this together in the right place. So we're going to be sewing this long curved seam first. So that's why I'm putting the pins in that way. So we're going to start from this point here. We're going to sew a 1/4 inch down and then all the way around to the back, and then we're going to pivot at the back and then come up to the top. So we're going to leave this short curved edge open, because we need to turn this round the right way. So let's just put some pins in just to help us hold this in place, ready for stitching this. It's just so that the pieces don't move away from each other, really. And so I've kept those in their pairs, because this will give us, when we're finished, this will give us a left and a right, which is what we need. So those are all pinned together. Let me move my press mat, and then we'll get onto the sewing machine. So for this first one, I'm just starting on this flat edge. Line it up with the edge of my presser foot. I'm going to take a few stitches forward, a couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches back, just to anchor those stitches, and then we're going to go down towards the point. And you can either draw on or guesstimate where you need to be. If we put a needle in the work, we can then pivot and just see if our edge of the stitches are on the edge. I think I need one more stitch, so I'll hand crank that, because that's the safest way of making sure that we get that right. And there we are, right on the edge. And now I can just sew along this edge here. Just remember, we're on a curve, so you might need to just pivot and change direction. Just move your pins if they get in your way. And you're trying not to pull this, try not to yank your collar around, treat it gently, because we want it to keep its beautiful shape. As we get down to the bottom here, just take a few steps, and you're trying to look at the fabric at the side of where your needle is mostly. So let's just take a few stitches now, just as we curve around this corner. Excuse my squeaky pedal. Let's take it nice and steady, just a few stitches at a time. We don't have much sewing to do on these little collars, do we? So we just want it to be nice and rounded. Then up to the top, and then I'm just going to reverse at the top there as well, just to hold on to that. Needle out, take our starting and ending threads off, and then hopefully you can see we've got a stitch line here all the way around to the bottom there, and then up to the corner here. So let's do that with the other one, and then we're going to trim this collar, this edge here, which is really important on this collar, so it'll sit nice and flat when we turn it round. So I'll sew my other one, and I'll come back to you when we're going to clip this collar. Okay, so we've got our two collar pieces here all ready to go, and the first thing that we're going to do is now start and trim around this extra edge. I'm going to use my pinking shears, but remember you can also use your snips, and by going up to but not through, or just a few fibres away from that edge, you'll be able to just clip out some little triangles like this, and that will do the same trick as using your pinking shears. It just takes a little bit longer. If you do go through your line of stitching, just go back and reinforce it with another row of stitches around it. But you're just trying to take some of this bulk out of this long edge, because when we fold that edge into the centre, it's this longer edge is going into a smaller space. It's just a bit of geometry, but that's what happens, and that's why it makes it so bulky if we're not careful. The other thing we want to do is actually take off the corner as well on the back, so that's on that back edge. So let's take off the corner on both of those while we're here, so we remember. This back edge here doesn't need any trimming because that's not on a curve. It's just on this curved edge that we need to be able to actually take that fibre down. Don't get too close to your stitches, otherwise you will, as I say, compromise that and your stitches will pop through. But that's what mine looks like when it's been done. Let's do the other one as well. Apologies if you can hear my voices in the background. My husband's on a conference call, but I really want to get this done for you. First thing I'm going to do is just give them a quick press flat, just to set those stitches. Give them a blow to let them cool down. And we need to be careful while we're turning these, because this is a bias cut edge, so that will stretch if we're not careful, and we don't want it to. So we're just going to push this through very nice and gently through the gap. And these collars on little clothes like this are really tiny. Very cute, but very tiny. And then if you've got something like a knitting needle, or I can use the edge of my seam gauge here, you just want to get something into the corners there, and you're just kind of pulling it out where the stitch line is, and just smoothing around to get a lovely smooth edge on that collar. In the point, obviously, we need to get that to point out. Knitting needles work very well for this kind of job as well. So again, let's use that pin just to dig in until we can see our stitches, and then we'll know we're right on that corner edge. That's much better. So it just needs a little bit extra, just pulling off that, taking off that corner. Okay, so there we've got one just there. So once we're happy that, just roll it through your fingers and thumb, just to make sure you're right on that edge. So we want these to be the same as well, don't we? So push that right out, and then once you've done that, then you can carefully just take it to your ironing board and iron it. If you want to use a seam gauge, a press cloth, then you can use a press cloth as well, just to make sure that you don't damage the fabric at all. And there we've got one lovely collar. This is the back edge, and that's the lovely curvy edge. Got a little bit of a dog ear sticking out there, which is just a little bit of excess of the seam fabric. So I'm just going to take that off, and the back is fine. So there we go, we've got one part of our collar done. So I'm just going to repeat that exact same process for the back, and then we'll meet back again and we'll look at attaching those onto our bodice. So the first thing that we want to do with our collars is just put one over the other and just make sure that they are the same size as far as we can be sure. Got a nice identical curve on the corner there, and then they're pretty much the same on the back there as well, so I'm happy that they're the same size. And when we look at them, we want to put them down so that we've got the straight edge at the back, and we've got this curved edge at the front, because the curved edge at the front is the front of our collar. Let's take one of our bodice pieces here, and this collar is going to then be sewn around. Before we do that, let's just pop this bodice in half first, and let's just identify where our centre front point is. So let's just put a little finger press in there so that we've got that marked. You can just about see it. If I wanted to, I could just do a little mark with my Frixion pen, couldn't I? Or you can put a little pin in there if you wanted to as well, just to mark that centre front. But I'm marking inside the seam allowance just in case that Frixion pen doesn't come off. So the next thing we want to do is put the front of the collar pieces so that it's right on that centre front, and then we're going to then pin through that to hold it in place. And we can do that, it's going to lie nicely on the front towards the collar, but then we're going to have to just fold it gently around the back here, because the back isn't wanting to sit quite as flat for me. Yours might, but mine isn't. So just by manipulating it with my fingers along that seam allowance, I've just got it to lie flat. So you can't see it very well, but there's my collar on top of my bodice, and there's the bodice there. Hopefully you can see the difference between the two. So let's go on to the other one now. So that's right at the very front, and we need to get that other piece, front collar piece, right on the very front there. So they're together. I'm going to have a pin again at the front here, and one towards the centre back, so it's just before the seam, just before the shoulder. And then I'm just going to just manipulate the fabric on the shoulder just so that it sits nicely against the collar, because that's going to give us the shaping that's going to go around the back. So we need that little bit of shaping, but so don't go cutting anything off. Just manipulate your fabric underneath so that it then moves around and it's onto your collar. So the first thing that we're going to do then is just run a little row of stitches just inside our seam allowance, so not at the full 1/4 inch, around here, and just to hold that in place, because it's very difficult to try and keep your collar in place otherwise, because we're going to need to put this other piece of fabric on the top. But if we just take the time, and you can tack it by hand if you want to, or you can just use your machine. And I'm just going to move my needle across now to the full 7, so that should, and I'll just take it off the edge. And I'm just not going to reverse stitch. I'm just going to take a couple of stitches forward and take that first pin out and put my needle in the work just to hold it steady for me. And I'm going to just pivot around the edge, just here, because it's just a really tight curve. And I'm just doing less than the full seam allowance. Take your pins out as you get to them. But that's just going to hold this collar in place without any pins for us, so that when we actually come to put the next layer on, the collar will stay in place for us. Just be careful on your transition, make sure that you've got that, the transition between the two collar pieces, make sure that that's sitting nice and straight and not moving. I need to pivot a little bit more. Try not to yank your fabric round, just be gentle with it. Because you're working with curves and that's a bias edge, we don't want to stretch that edge at all. Don't need to go all the way to the end, you're just going to off the edge of the collar and that's enough. So let's just take those threads off. And I can now see that that collar's now firmly fixed onto that bodice there, as we can hopefully just see that just there. So let's just move this machine to one side, because the next thing we need to do now is take our lining piece of fabric, and we are going to again make a little note of where that centre front is. Just mark it with a finger press, just use the heat and the wet of your fingers just to keep that together. And then that's going to go directly between those front two collar pieces, and I'm going to put a pin in. And that's my first anchor point. The next anchor point is we're going to go right to the very edge of the bodice, to the where it's going to start and go down that long flat bit at the edge. And we're just going to put another pin in directly to that corner. Make sure they're on top of each other, because that's our next anchor point. And then we can go down to the bottom of the bodice and put a pin down there just to hold that all together. Let's go to the other side. So you're right, and if you noticed, I haven't pinned around the collar yet, because we want to get everything else all squared up first. So again, let's go to the other side here. Put a pin in towards the corner. I try and avoid, I'm just off the collar, I'm not pinning the collar as well, I'm just doing these back edges. And then let's get that nice and straight on top of each other. Hold that together. And then now we want to look at our seam allowance, because our seam allowances want to be on top of each other to keep that bulk down. So open those seam allowances out, and then let's put a pin at the top of our shoulders there. So that's our next reference point that we can use to make sure everything's all lined up together. Just get that piece on there. That's it. Pin down the middle there. And then when you come to put a couple of pins either side of your centre pin for your neckline now, that should all be sitting nice and straight for you. Just put a couple couple of pins in just to hold it together so it doesn't shift while we're stitching it down. Just give your pins a twist if they won't go through straight away because you've got a few layers there. So that's what it's looking like at the moment. So we've got pin from this long straight edge down towards the neck. We're going to pivot at that point and go around the neck. Then we're going to come to this point here and pivot again and end up down the bottom down here. And then we'll be able to turn all of this round. Okay, let's go. I'll just move my needle position back to my 1/4 inch so I've got that all lined up nicely. Let's put the end of our fabric through under here and take a couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches back, and then let's put our needle in our work so that's all nice and anchored down. First pin out and then straight up the back here. Coming up to a pin, so let me just stop and take that pin out, and then we want to go to around that 1/4 inch point away from the neckline edge. So let's just pivot and just see, oh no, I've got too much, so let me just do another stitch and try again. Okay, that's fine for me. There's my awl, let me use my awl, so that will help us keep everything together. So now I'm just going to start and take a few stitches, and I can start and move it round the curve because it's fairly gentle at first. And then take the pin out at the top of the shoulder when you get close to there, but I'm going to actually pivot before we get to the top of the shoulder. Try and keep to your 1/4 inch if you can, and then pivot again to come round, start and come around this front neckline. Just remember your machine's going through quite a few different layers at this point. Take the pin out and then let me pivot again just to make sure that's going right. Also a little pivoting around these tight little necklines, and then take this pull the pin out and pivot again to make sure the next few stitches are going to be straight. So going across the centre front, and you can see the fabric coming round the back of the machine as well at the same time as we sew round this delicate little neckline. Pin out just there, and then again. Just make sure your seam allowance is sitting nice and flat. Pin out on the top of the shoulders. I know it only looks like only small adjustments, but you'll be surprised how much smoother it will make your stitching even with just those really small adjustments. Round to the top of this neckline now. I'll take that pin out. Quite a big change here. Let's go off to the corner. Just measure that up, see if we're right. Perhaps one more stitch. And then we go down. One more stitch sometimes just makes quite a bit of difference. And then we're down this straight edge now. Take the pin out at the end. And just reverse on the end here. Needle out of the work. And let's take off our starting and ending threads. And let's have a little look how we've done. Oops, that's my scissors. So we started here at the flat edge, sewn along here, pivoted there, and then we twisted around this corner. Look how lovely and smooth those stitches are around that neckline. And then we came out to the side here, pivoted here, and then all the way down to the bottom. Now there's something we need to do before we actually turn this round, because we're going from a smaller edge to a wider edge. So here we can do some little snips. So first of all, let's take off the corners at the top of our bodice here and just take off just slightly wider than 90 degrees at both of those 2 points. Don't go through your stitches, but not quite up to them, just a few fibres away, and that should hopefully just make those turn nicely. And then on this curved neckline edge just here, we're going to do some little snips. So I want you to just put the nose of your scissors, don't put the whole of the blade of your scissors over, just the nose, just so you don't get too excited and snip too hard, because you have to put, because you're going through you're going through 4 layers of fabric, so it's quite stiff, but we need to just put these little snips in, because can you see how they spread open when you stretch on this neck? And that's what needs to happen. So we're just going to go up 2 but not through, and we're going through all 4 layers, going through the collar and 2 layers, because there's an in and out of the collar, and we're going to do them quite close together. The tighter the curve, the closer together your snips should be. These little snips. Just press on the blades if you need to. Right the way round, all the way round to the edge here. So if I straighten this curve line now, can you see how those have to stretch in order to get that line straight? And that's what we need for when we then sew this. So there's our little snips all the way through there. First thing I'm going to do, you can use your press cloth again if you want to, that's fine. Just going to press these stitches in place so that's all nice and flat to start off with. And then what I'm going to do is just start and use the nose of my iron and just kind of push the lining away from one side to the other, just around that neckline edge. Hopefully you can see, so I'm just using the nose of my iron just to press down on there. So you can see that's now sticking up. Now I want to turn it over and put that side down, and I'm folding, and just hold on to your collar a bit. Let's turn through these corners, shall we, in the edge there. That would be good. Just be careful if you're using anything with a point that you don't go through your fabric, because that should be nice and square at the back of the neckline there. Use the pin if you need to, just to get that to turn through for you. Because we want the back of this dress to be lying really flat. So I've just opened up that area there, just put that so you've got all your stitches, just roll it through your finger and thumb if you need to, and let's just give that a little press. Go to the other side as well, because we need this to just get our bearings for where we are. Make sure that's all nice and pushed out and nice and flat. And then where we push the lining, so you've got your collar in the middle of the two pieces of fabric, and it's not going to want to sit straight to start off with. We've got to coax it with the iron. Let's take the top of the collar, keep the collar straight, flat, and then just use the tip of your iron and just push the fabric out of the way on one side. And let's just do the other side again. Keep your collar flat, because that's what needs to happen. Your collar needs to be flat. We've got a whole lot of curving going on this edge here. So now what I would do is open out my seam allowances, make sure they're open, and put the two tops of the shoulders together. I'm just going to put a little pin just to hold those together. And then come to this side as well, because this all helps everything stay square. So seam allowances on the top there, make sure the edges of the fabric are together. Another pin just there. And that should start to help you see your collar and your bodice. So now I've got the collar curved slightly. So you can't have the collar straight and the bodice straight at the same time, because the laws of curves and whatever just won't allow you. So we're just doing it in sections. I'm just ironing the bodice now to make sure that's flat. And then let's curve this round here. So the bodice again at the front, centre front is all curved. And this is where we're going to make sure that, and I've got the collar pulled out, look, at the front. And the bodice is on top of each other. And let's just give that a bit of a press going up here, just to make sure that that's all lying as flat as we can. So if we get a good pressed edge on the edge of this collar, then when we actually fold the collar down, oops, let me do it the other way around, because we've got the bow where we've got the pins. Because we can just finger press that down at the moment, we can press it down properly in a second. That's going to curve beautifully around the neckline, look, to the back. This one needs to be pressed down over the top of the bodice. Now that we've got the bodice all pressed out, a little bit of steam would be your friend as well at this point. So you can see how the bodice is lying nice and flat on my ironing board. And then when we put that onto the dress, look how beautifully that's all going to lie nice and flat. Got a little thread there. So there's our shoulders. And there's the front of our collar. The little bit at the back is going to overlap, because that's where we're going to put our fastenings for our dress. and we're going to sew our sleeves in first, and then we'll sew our side seams down. But as you can see, all the edges of the collar are all very nice and neatly hidden inside that bodice, which is a lovely, lovely finish, and I really like that. And this will all sit down nicely once we've got Clara dressed. At the moment it's because it's not got the body in it. Let's just try her on it and just see how it's going to look. Can't resist. So let's just pop that in there, keep her ribbon out of the way. Shoulder seams on her shoulders, and there she's going to, you can see that collar looking beautiful and just sitting nicely on there. Okay, it's coming, Clara, we're getting on with it, don't worry. So let's just take our pins out of our sleeve. Now we have got a little centre notch on the top of our sleeve. I do want to put a little snip in there because that's an important place. So we're going to mark that notch by just putting a little snip in our fabric just at that very centre top point of the shoulder, because we need to match that. So let's get our lining board again, because we're going to turn up that 1/4 inch. And if you remember before, let's just iron these flat first. So we've got those nice and flat. And then using our pins on our seam gauge, let's turn up the 1/4 inch that we need to on the bottom of the sleeves. Quite a bouncy fabric, so it's not wanting to sit quite right for me, so let's just put a pin in the centre there. Check the edge here, make sure that's at 1/4 inch. It is. So I do find it helpful just to pin down the edges of these small hems. It just saves you burning your fingers. Just pin that down, and once that's pinned down, then we can then just press over the top of that and hold that flat. So do that to the second one, because once we've done those, got those pinned down, because that gives that memory, doesn't it, on the edge, we're then going to zigzag along this edge, and I'm going to learn from doing the from doing the bloomers, and we're just going to run a row of stitches across there just to hold that flat first before we then go and add our lace on. So if you want to iron your hem over on both and then get to your machine, we'll zigzag first and then we'll hem it on both of them. So let's go and do that. Actually, I've had an idea. While we're just doing this and adding the lace, let's do the same to the skirt as well, because we're doing the same steps here. We might as well use it while we've got our machine set up. So if you just want to get your dress skirt fabric, just take your label off if you've got a label. And then we're going to just have a quick look at, I don't think there's a top and a bottom to this. Just make sure there's not a top and a bottom to your fabric with the design. You might have one where you prefer to the other. I'm going to use that way, I think. And then I want you to just go along the edge of your skirt here and turn up 1/4 inch as well. So we're going to do that one. Just nice and easy all the way along. So let's just do the same thing with the skirt and get it to the same point, and then we can do that all at the same time. Okay, so it's just a few minutes later. There's the 1/4 inch turned up on the bottom of the sleeves, and here's the 1/4 inch turned up on one long edge of our hem. And all we're going to do now is select the zigzag stitch on our machine, and I'll have it at a 3 width and a 2 length, and that should be enough. We're going to fold out the edge so that it's not folded under, because we just want to go across the edge of this seam. And I'm just going to then zigzag across here just to neaten it. We're going to do something called chain piecing. Which is when we come to the end of one piece, we're just going to open out the seam on the other, and we're just going to pop it straight under and run from one piece of fabric onto the next. And then we can do the same with the skirt piece as well. We can just open out that hem, and we're just going to go straight from one onto the other. So zigzag all the way along all of your pieces, and then when you get to the end you can just snip them off between the pieces and take off the starting and ending threads, and just take off any whiskers, just any little threads that are just poking out, because we don't need any of those. Same one here, I've got a few on this piece, look, because that just neatens that all up. And then when we finish doing that, oops, do that one as well. We're just going to refold that over where that memory is anyway, and I'm just going to run a narrow hem just along the edge of there, just so I'll probably do it from this side so I can see where I am, and just towards the end through the zigzagging, just to hold that hem down for us so that that's neatened. I'm going to do that on both of the sleeves, and I'm also going to do that on the hem of the skirt as well, and then we'll be ready for attaching our lace. So once you've got your hems down on your sleeves and on your bottom of your hem of your dress, we're going to take your ribbon piece again, we're going to match it up with the edge, and if you remember on the pantaloons we had it so that the scallops were just over the edge of the dress, so the sleeves of the dress, and we can then just take a pin and just pin that in place on the edge there. Once you get going you can probably just hold it in place, but if you want to be really precise then let's just pin that in place. That gives a nice scalloped hem, doesn't it, edge to that dress there. And then we're going to I'm going to use a straight stitch this time in order just to attach the ribbon on to the bottom of the sleeves. And when I get to the end of one piece, I'll just snip and then just join the next piece and then put the hem through and then do the same thing. But the other thing that we're going to do in a minute is we're going to neaten these side edges here with the zigzag, but I want to get this lace on first. So make sure that your thread matches the colour of your lace on the top at least, so that you're not going to see your stitches when you add on. So if you've got a pink thread in your machine at the moment, just change it to that cream or that off-white so that you're not going to see your stitches. Okay, so there's the first little piece on. And all you can do is just put the lace on in line. Just start a little bit off the edge. Make sure you've got your little scallops over the edge of your sleeve. And then I've lined the ribbon up so that I'm just sewing through that long bit just there. And I've not reverse stitched, it's just a little bit thick getting it going, so I've just had to pull just to get it going on my starting threads. And when I've got to the bottom here, I've just got hold of my skirt. Put the edge of the scallops just over the edge, and I've just run straight from one onto the other. And just do about an inch and then just stop and just reposition where you are. And just make sure that you're happy with those scallops. So saving a little bit of time by working on the skirt and the sleeves at the same time and doing the same sections together. Just depends if you like to finish off one piece before the other. You can always come back and just rewind the video so you can see where you are. Just coming to the end here, so let's just take the end off just there, at the end of a scallop. Take the threads off. There's our transition between our sleeves, so just cut through the lace there and cut through our starting threads. So there's our sleeve, 2 sleeves done there, all the lovely lace on, and there's the hem of our skirt with the lovely lace on the scalloped edge. The next thing that I want you to do, we're finished with our lace now, put that to one side, is I want you just to use your zigzag stitch and just run some neatening stitches just down either side of your sleeve and also down this long these 2 short edges of your skirt, because we want to neaten those edges. So take it back to your zigzag stitch, and we want a stitch width of 3 and a stitch length of 2. That's what I use for mine. And then just starting on the edge just here, just going to neaten along these edges here. So once you've got your lace all on the bottom of your skirt, on the bottom of and you've got your edges neatened, we're going to change our thread back over now to our pink or whatever colour you're using for your gathering, because we need to put some gathering stitches in, because the top of the sleeves and the waist edge of the skirt are all going to be gathered. So let's change that over, and again we're going to save some time by doing the same steps together in the whole points, in the whole garment. So let me change my threads over and we'll get going. Let's make sure we've got our machine set up for our gathering stitches first. So I've got a straight stitch. I'm going to let my tension off. So my tension's at a 5 and I'm taking mine down to about a 2.5. and I'm just going to take my stitch length up from a 2.2 or a 3 up to a 4. Let's do the skirt first because that's a nice long straight piece. We're going to put our piece of fabric, skirt fabric, under our presser foot, and we're going to do the first row of stitching about 1/8 of an inch in from the edge, and then we're going to put our second row of stitches, because we need 2 rows of stitches for gathering, like we did on the pantaloon for the waist. Did we gather there? No, we didn't. Where did we gather? For the hat, for the bonnet. So first one is at 1 inch, and the second row of stitching is at 3/8 of an inch in. So let's just do that now, and we don't reverse and stop, so if you don't go backwards and forwards, and also you need to have a tail left on your thread, so if you've got a machine that cuts the threads for you, you need to switch that off because you need a tail of threads. Just guide this fabric through to start off with, just 1/8 of an inch through. Try and keep it straight. And the one thing you can't do when you're doing your gathering stitches is that you can't cross over one line to the other, so it does need to be really straight. So that's the first line done on this one, so let's just take that on through. So you need to leave a tail, remember. So we can't chain piece these quite the same way. Now on a sleeve, we're going to start at this bottom edge. We're going to start here. We're going to follow around just at 1/8 of an inch for a seam all the way through. So just 1/4 of a centimetre. It's really, really quite a tiny little seam that we're sewing. We just need to get around that edge. If we put a needle in our work, again, we can pivot around the top of this sleeve cap. Just keep it nice and neat in. Sorry for the squeaking. So needle out. Oops, that's gathering already, look, because it's caught on my needle. We need just keep that a nice edge because we don't want it gathered just yet. And then we're going to do the other sleeve. And then once we've done that, we're going to put these all back in the machine again, and we need a gap between those 2 rows of stitching. So there's my pink stitching in already. I'm going to leave 2/8 of an inch there, or 1/2 centimetre between those, and then put another row just alongside it. Okay. So follow the curve of the sleeve top because that's really important. Just pivot where you need to, just to get that nicely around the top. Sleeve up, and just pull that off. And there we go. So now we can do both of them now. And generally what I do is I just run the edge of my presser foot along where I was before, and then that will usually give you enough of a gap. There's our 2 rows of stitching. Can you see those? 1, 2 just there. You don't want these 2 rows of stitching to cross over each other because you won't be able to gather if they do, so make sure you've got a gap between the 2. Let's put the second row of stitching in the tops of our sleeves, and then we'll come back. Don't worry about neatening this top edge of the sleeve or about neatening the waist edge here, because you don't want the bulk of that zigzag stitch when you gather it, because that zigzag stitch does add some bulk. And we're going to hide that inside the dress bodice between your lining and your dress top, so you won't see it. So don't zigzag that section. I should have said that earlier. I'll probably put a note on just so that you know. Okay, let me just put the second row of stitching around the top of the sleeves. Then we'll be putting our skirt to one side for the moment. We won't need that because we'll just be working on inserting our sleeves. Okay, so let's go back. We're going to need our bodice and we're going to need our sleeves as well. So we're going to work on one side at a time. And if you fold these in half, you can see that they're identical, so it doesn't matter whether there's a back or a front. Generally on adults or children's clothing, there will be a different curve for the back of the front. It doesn't match on this small doll sleeve. But just be aware that in this case that we haven't, but if you were sewing along in the future, you might have a front and a back to a sleeve, and normally you'll have one notch on your front sleeve edge and on your front bodice edge, and 2 notches on your back sleeve and your back bodice edge, so you'll know to be able to match that up. But for now, we just want to locate where our centre notch is, that little snip that we put in at the top. I'm going to take the pins out, and then just decide which is going to be your top bodice. It doesn't matter on my fabric because it's such a lovely ditzy print, but just have a look at the front of your bodice, front and back, and just choose which one you want to be if you've got the same fabric on both sides. We haven't understitched the collar yet, have we? We'll understitch the collar in a minute because that's a nice thing to do as well. So let's just do we'll do the sleeves first. Okay, sorry, digressing. So we're going to take the right side of the sleeve and we're going to pop it right side down onto our bodice, and that little snip for the notch is going to go directly on top of our sleeve, of our shoulder seam. So you're going to put 1 pin in just to hold that directly in place. Just keep your collar out of the way, you don't need that in the way at the moment. We're then going to take the bottom edge of the sleeve and match it with a point at the underarm and put a pin in there because that's a match point too. And then we're going to go over to the other side and take the, just keep your threads out the way, and take the other side and match the other side of the underarm seam with the back of the bodice. And I've got my pin head sticking up. Look, there's our sleeve and there's the shoulder, the arm side of our bodice. The next thing we're going to do is then take our quick unpick and just separate out our fibres for our gathering, our threads for the top, because we're then going to just hold on to the threads and hold on to the fabric and just gather that slightly until both the seam edges are the same size. Doesn't take much at all, it's just going to take a little bit. And then what we're going to do is, once they're lying on top of each other all beautifully nice and flat, so you're then going to put a couple of pins in, just 1 in there, keep your raw edges together, and then on the bottom here, raw edges together there as well. And we've got curves going at different directions, so we just need to be aware of where all this fabric is to make sure that that's all lying flat under your pin. So you want to make sure you're not pinning any puckers in on your bodice size. So can you see I've got a little bit of some undulation going on, but I've not actually pinned in any puckers on there at all. Let's do the other side again. So let's take those two, our quick unpick, and just separate out our top from our bottom threads. So that we can pull those. Then holding on to our top threads, we're just going to hold on to that and just put a couple of little gathers. It doesn't need much, it's just a small amount just to reduce the length of the sleeve edge so that it'll actually fit into the bodice. If you want some more tips on gathering and you haven't watched the video for doing the bonnet yet, then I go into gathering more detail for the bonnet because there's quite a lot there, so you can always pop there and have a quick look rather than me bore you to death with all the detail just here. So let's put those raw edges together for that sleeve, making sure that we're not pinning in any puckers into our bodice edge. We can have the gathers in the sleeve edge, but not in our bodice edge, because that's the sleeve edge can have some gathering in it. It's nice and feminine sometimes to have a gathered sleeve head, isn't it? So that's what it's looking like. That's what it's looking like from the inside. And then from the outside, that's where it's pinned. And I can see that we've got a bit there we've got to be careful of. That's just at the underarm. But if we manipulate that out as we're sewing round, then we should be fine and we shouldn't get any puckers in there on that stitching line. We're going to do one at a time because trying to work and do both of these with all these pins in would be an absolute nightmare. So just make sure that you do one at a time. And when you're ready, we're going to change our thread over. I've still got pink in mine. Let me change my thread over. Change my thread over. The other thing that we need to do is tighten up our tension as well, up to just under 5 for me. So remember, we loosened it off while we were gathering so that we can gather our stitches up. But now we're doing our straight stitching, we actually need now to have it set at the correct tension for sewing these garments. I'm going to have the sleeve side up and I'm going to have the bodice side down, but we've just got to be really, really careful with these because it is quite a small space that we're sewing with. So let's get this lined up again to, we're on stitch number 1 for me, which is my straight stitch. I need to take my stitch length back down to a 2, and I need my stitch width down to a 2 as well, because we were on a straight stitch before. Length down. 6.5 to give us our quarter length. Right, okay. So now on this one, actually, I'm going to, because can you see how I've got it positioned at the moment with all of my presser foot over onto my fabric? If I try and, can I stop the light from hitting it? I can't, can I? So I've got my presser foot, let me just show you, so that all of the presser foot was on the edge, because I was using this edge for my seam allowance. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my needle across to the left so I can use other marks on my fabric, probably the centre mark here in the gap there for my seam allowance, because then I've got less of this on my presser foot on my sewing, and it'll make it easier. So let me just move that across, probably to 0.5, and then we've got less on our presser on our fabric, and I'm sewing directly between those 2 rows of gathering. So let's take a couple of stitches forward and a couple of stitches back and put our needle in the work, and take the first pin out wherever my pin cushions want to. Needles in the work, and we're going to be starting with coming straight onto the first part of the gather. Just make sure your seam allowances are up. And so we're going to take a couple of stitches, then forward again, and we're starting to go around this sleeve head. So let's take these pins out as we go, and let's just pivot this garment round, and just make sure that you're just sort of moving fabric around as you can do underneath to try and make it as flat as possible. It can be a little difficult, and it is a little tricky, and if you wanted to sew these sleeves in by hand, then that's something that you could do if you wanted to, and you might find that you have a little bit more control of your fabric. Just make sure all your seam allowances are up, and let's go up around the top of this fabric, pin in again. I'm just going to pivot, just trying to make sure everything's lying nice and flat. Around the top here. Great place as well for using your awl as well, just to keep everything nice and straight. Lift your presser foot up and just make sure that everything's kind of lying as flat as you can for the next little bit that you're going to sew. This is why we have quite a few pins in this type of thing. You could always have tacked it as well if you'd have wanted to. That would have been a good move, to just tacked it as well, just to make sure that everything's in place. Let's come off the edge here, and then just reverse stitch at the end here. Needle out of the work, keep your fingers crossed. Take the starting threads off. Let's have a little look. Oh, I have sewn a little pucker into mine. Front's fine. That's all okay. That's all nice and neat. So now I've sewn a pucker in. Let me show you how we put that right with my glasses. So all I do is go to the first point where the fabric has gone onto the pucker, and I'll take out that first stitch. Just be careful. You're just going through your stitches, and then I take out any stitches that are in the wrong place that are affecting that pucker. And to like 1 or 2 stitches past it. And then can you see I just released that fabric, and now when I look at it, it does want to sit flat. So now I know that the back there is fine. All I'll do is I'll join my stitches up just a couple of stitches before here. So I stitch through there onto the top, and then I'll sew through the gap, and then I'll sew a couple of stitches past the gap as well. If you've watched any of my videos, I'll tell you it's not about not going wrong in stitching, it's about knowing how to put it right again if you do. So let's take a couple of stitches over where the stitching was good already and put the needle in the work. We're going to pivot round for coming round here, and I'm just keeping my eye on this bodice fabric to make sure that that's out of the way and lying flat. Just make sure that that's all lying nice. Then come up to the existing stitching where it was good. And you can reverse if you want to, but as long as you've gone over your stitching, you should be fine. Take those threads off. And there we go, look, now we've got no pucker in that bodice and no pucker in the underneath either. So once you've checked your bodice, make sure that your sleeve has gone in fine and without any more puckers anywhere. And then you can then go ahead and take out your threads. So put on the one that you've already pulled on if you can. Oops. So there's one that come out. Take the underneath one out as well. And then let's take the top thread out. See if it gets stuck on this. It might do. No, it's come straight out. That's good. Bottom one has come out as well. So let's just make sure that's all come out. So you should have four pieces of thread that you're then discarding. So there's our sleeve, all in, looking all beautiful just there. And that will be right for the edge there. So then go ahead and now insert your other sleeve the same way. Okay, so I'm just testing by putting the second sleeve in by hand, and I think that might be a better idea. I'm just using a back stitch, and that's just giving me these little stitches onto the side here. You'll be able to look and see how you do a back stitch. But basically you move forward one stitch, but then you go back half a stitch and then forward a stitch. So you're kind of sewing backwards first from where your thread has come out. So I'll go in just there. And then that just gives you this little nice little neat running stitch. And this way you can just control a little better that bodice, because when I've tried to go back in again as well and to do this side, then it's not wanting to sit very flat for me. I think it's just because it's just such a tight curve that I just think that that is probably going to save you some frustration. It's not a long seam, it doesn't take long to do. It can be quite therapeutic really as well, but you can just manipulate that fabric and just have a little bit of a better look at where you are. So that one's that's where it's all going in. So I don't know if you can see my little neat little stitches in there. And then we'll have a look, we'll compare the two at the end and see, but I know that it might be quicker to machine sew, but sometimes on these tiny things we might be fine if we were doing this at a 16-inch size character, putting the sleeves in, because the clothes would be that little bit bigger, wouldn't they? But on these tiny, this is for the 10-inch Clara doll, then it is really quite tiny. Anyway, right, let's have a quick look. So there's my hand sewn one, and that's gone in there nicely. And that's my machine sewn one that was also went in nicely. So you can either tack it by hand or you can just sew it. Will I go over it again? No, it should be fine. Once it's pressed, that should be okay. All right, so we're going to take out the gathering stitches on this one now. Just pull those out. That's one. There's two. There's three. And there's four. So that's all out now. And then that sleeve is sitting really nicely in there as well. Okay, so the next stage then we're going to go to is the underarm, and we're going to put the two edges of the cuff lace together. And we're going to put the underarm of our seam together. I'm going to put the seam allowance in towards my bodice, I think. Yeah, in towards my bodice. And then I'm going to pin along here. So let's pin at that point just there. Let's pin at the underarm with the seam allowance in towards the bodice. And then we're going to just another pin just at the bottom of the bodice just to hold it together. That's just a really short seam, but that's just where we need to go. If you need any more down this straight edge of the sleeve, then go ahead and put some more pins in. And then we're going to take it to the machine, start here, reverse stitch all the way to here. I'm going to stop right on top of my stitching wherever I put my sleeve in and pivot to change direction, because you've got a bit of a right angle to go through down here and across, so we need to pivot and then come across. Okay, that's what I'm going to do next.